Welcome to the Real Business Lifetime Lessons podcast, where Carolina business leaders get real about growth, grit, and leadership. Today's guest is Jim White, a seasoned innovator whose career spans telecom, healthcare, and now food traceability. As the co-founder and president of Incesso for Food, Jim is bringing smart, scalable technology to the most overlooked parts of the food supply chain, helping farmers and fishermen meet FDA traceability rules with tools that work for them. With decades of experience navigating regulated industries, Jim's approach is all about cutting through complexity, building alignment, and focusing on what truly matters. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Aubrey.
Jim, could you tell us how your various career experience has tied you into what you are doing now and what led you to co-found Incesso for Food?
If there's a thread that's operated through my career, I would call it market development. What that means is every once in a while, there are new product categories or markets that develop. When I started in telecom, I was involved in the broadband and then eventually IPTV and some media things. And then I transitioned over to the healthcare space where I did some connected hospital work, which got me linked into FDA things. And Incesso for Food is a market development, a company that's pivotal in the market development of the food traceability space, which is evolving because of some new FDA regulations that are going to be kicking in the next few years.
Can you walk us through how that collaboration with your previous involvement in a company you've worked with before and how that led you into this new collaboration?
I had been working with a company that was using some software that we're using today in Incesso for Food from a company called Incesso. And this track key software we were using to trace methadone for opiate treatment programs, OTPs. And there's about 500 of those in the United States. People who have substance abuse problems, they use methadone as a substitute for the illicit drugs that they're buying as a way to manage the process of recovery. But that medicine is dangerous too. And so we had built a solution at the company I was at that was basically tracing and using IoT to distribute methadone out of a little IoT device. And our track key software was actually tracking that where that medicine went, when people took it, and was keeping track of all the little transactions. What happened is I had left that company and moved on, and then Kreshmir, who was the head of Incesso, called me. They had entered into the low-cost food traceability challenge by the FDA with that same platform that they had designed for food traceability. They were one of the 10 winners out of 100. And he said, "Hey, this is great, except for we're not an American company." That's where me and my partner, John Moss, we basically set up a U.S. company, which we call Incesso for Food, for the purposes of doing food traceability in the United States.
Across all the industries that you've worked through, what have you found to be consistent when it comes to building something from scratch?
The first thing you have to do is really understand what motivates the marketplace to move. And usually that's done by trial and error. You almost always go in with this idea, this preconceived notion that something will operate or work in a certain way. So for example, when I was running the connected hospital program at Alcatel, that was my first venture into the healthcare space. Now we were selling network equipment to the healthcare industry. And what I was expecting is that it would be a very altruistic business. It took me a few iterations to discover that actually it's the most money-driven business I had ever participated in. Even in technology, which you kind of give a pretty business-oriented, business-focused, bottom-line focused business, we did things just because it was cool sometimes, right? In the healthcare space, what I learned is they don't care. Unless it had a reimbursement or if it had some kind of a revenue stream associated with it, they would throw it right out the window. We actually had a digital stethoscope that was using some of our telephone technology, which was really inexpensive, and it was very powerful. It would have it allowed you to do these auscultations remotely and capture them and then put them into a system and do artificial intelligence. It would have been so powerful, super cool, all that sort of thing. We actually were working with a big Northeast hospital system. He had me talk to their chief medical officer. He looked at it and he said, "Why would I do that if I have echocardiograms in a hospital and I bill this much money for it?" And so the project didn't go anywhere. And that was a revelation. Wow, that's not what makes this business tick. For every project that every startup and everything I've ever worked on, you got to figure out what really makes the business tick.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's been eye-opening along the way.
Yes.
You have worked with FDA regulations, telecom giants, and government funded initiatives. What's one leadership lesson that's translated across every environment?
I mean, I think always the number one leadership thing is always listen. Really listen to what people are saying, what they're meaning. Try to understand what's driving them and motivating them. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's the government or if it's a big telecom company. There's people there. And now those people were shaped by the industry or the business that they're in, which is what I was trying to describe with the healthcare industry. But the same thing's true if you grew up in the military, if you grew up in telecom. Telecom had some very strong cultural things that were very engineering centric. They looked at things from a certain perspective. And if you could understand where they're coming from and then listen to them, you can get a sense of what makes them tick and what motivates them and what actually convinces them that something is a good solution or not, because they judge it based on the lens that they look through.
When you and I had our introductory call, you mentioned that there's a difference between knowing how to pivot and knowing how to double dribble. Is that something you'd be willing to unpack a little bit more? How does somebody know when it's time to shift versus staying the course?
I always model businesses because that's where I come from. I always imagine how I think it will work. Usually it's a spreadsheet model of the customer's going to pay this for this reason. There's this many of them, blah, blah, blah. And so in that embedded in it are a bunch of assumptions. And in the beginning, when you create your model, you're making assumptions out of nothing. As you engage the marketplace, you're always listening to say, wait, this assumption isn't true. And that becomes part of the decision of if this isn't true, then the general direction I'm going isn't the right direction at all. I need to move in a different direction. But at the same time, you need to stay anchored to some core proposition, and that's the idea of pivoting versus double dribbling, right? If, for example, you feel like the thing that I thought was really great about this business or about this particular venture, whatever it was, something about the economics of it or something about the core value proposition, if you discover that that isn't true, right, then you probably should quit. If on the other hand, it turns out that no, it's not that that's true, it's just the path to get there or the way people buy it or something is different, then you pivot and you turn and you start to address, maybe I have to sell through somebody else who has a reputation that's necessary to reach these kind of customers, or maybe I have to adjust my business model, I have to sell it differently and price it differently. Those are opportunities to pivot versus, so there's a distinction between when should I just pick up the ball and pass it to the other team and say, hey, let's start a new game.
What's been a moment in your entrepreneurial journey where things didn't go as planned, and how did you course correct?
Things never go as planned. That's always been a joke I have because it's, investors, everyone wants to see a plan, right? And and so there's always the recognition that the one thing I know about the plan is that it isn't right. On the other hand, it's related to the pivot thing. Because I have a plan, I know when things aren't going the way they should be going because I had a plan, right? And so actually the fact that it's not going like you expect it is really an important thing to be able to say, oh, I should be selling faster, more per week or whatever. It shouldn't take this long and set up a customer. It shouldn't be this hard. More people should be interested in this message because you had some expectations, you had a plan, but you shouldn't get discouraged by the fact that you're wrong. You should go in knowing I'm wrong. Now I need to figure out where I'm wrong and adjust based on that.
We have that discussion with my team, especially since several of them are newer in the industry. Fully expect sales calls not to go the way they think they will go. So now what do we learn from this and how do we adjust our approach for the next time?
Right.
As part of Incessos for Food, you guys are bringing technology to groups that traditionally haven't had much access to the technology, like farmers and fishermen. What have you learned about innovation along those margins?
We were told that group would be super resistant because they hate technology. So the assumption is because they don't have technology, it's because they don't like technology. What we've actually learned from doing it is they don't have technology because they never saw a good opportunity to use it that made sense in their business. So for us, we pay a lot of attention to what they do, how they do it. So we have two channels to market. We have what we call direct to customer that we're doing on our SaaS, and that's where we're focusing on these smaller simpler operationally driven kinds of businesses like farms and fishing operations and co-ops and packers and things like that on what we call the primary source of the food supply chain, the beginning of it. They grow a handful of products in a single place. They're not really complicated organizations. They may do a lot of business and a lot of volume, but they're very operationally focused. If we bring them operational value, they soak it up. One of our first customers, we sat down with them. We showed him the solution and how to set up a few things. And then basically that was a year ago. They've used it 4 or 5 times a week, 7, 8, 9, 10 transactions a day for a year straight with only a handful of questions to us. And they've actually showed us things about the platform and how to use it and how to apply it because they view it as a key tool to solve their problems. They know exactly what they want. And we've been really impressed by their ability to absorb and use technology, but they don't do it for the sake of technology. They do it for the sake of operational gain.
It makes sense no matter what industry we're approaching. You've got to show me why it's going to make my life easier or how it's going to make my product better. I'm not just going to adopt something just because it's flashy.
Sometimes in big companies, though, you can find a subject matter expert that likes things because they're complicated or because they're sophisticated. They can afford maybe to have people in those kind of roles. In a smaller business, it's got to get them from point A to point B as fast as possible.
Yeah, and the learning curve needs to be such that I don't feel like I'm
Exactly.
overwhelmed trying to put a new system or technology in place.
Absolutely.
How would you say that you've balanced compliance with creativity when it comes to serving customers who maybe have been underserved by the traditional technology systems?
I mean, we look for opportunities to add things to our product. One of the pivots, because one of the things that's happened is there was a deadline of January 20th of 2026 for everybody who was touching these certain foods on the food traceability list. That was a deadline. In March, the FDA recognized that hardly anybody was ready, and so they said, "Hey, we're gonna postpone the compliance deadline by 30 months." And we were kind of leaning on that, "Hey, you got to do this anyhow," sort of a thing. And at first, we were really devastated by the idea of it. But then when we reflected on what customers were really buying, they really never were buying compliance with FSMA 204. They needed traceability, and they were really, really excited by the idea that when they did the tasks that they had to do to get the traceability, which we made really simple, that they got all these peripheral benefits to it. Like it made putting case labels easier, printing those out easier. They were better. They were more supply chain ready. Because they did it in a digital system, they ended up with an inventory that they never had before, and they saw a lot of opportunities to leverage that. We realized that we were selling something different than what we thought we were from a value proposition perspective. And then they start to tell us like, hey, you know what you solve for us with this traceability stuff, why don't you do this over here with GAP certification and these other kind of documentation? And so we're looking at those as new opportunities to extend the product and make it richer and better. And there'll be certain people who will get it because they are frustrated by certification documentation. And there are lots of farms in the United States that drop their GAP certification just because they find that keeping up with that documentation is not worth it. And they can find some customers that don't require it, and they're content to do that. But they know that they miss a lot of customer opportunities by not maintaining that certification. So if we can solve that problem, that'll be a great thing for them.
So you have an approach that helps demystify something that can be very complex. What's something about building business that's just simpler than most people think?
I think the key is to really focus on what really is the value. In our particular case, we became the experts in FSMA 204 because a lot of people talk about it in this abstract way. FSMA 204 is Food Safety Modernization Act. Section 204 is about traceability from end to end, from the farm all the way to the retail. When you look at it, you see all these things that have to happen to make it work. But when you look at it from the perspective of anybody that has to do their little part in it, it's actually really simple. Oh, you just have to fill out, you have 2 or 3 critical tracking events and 6 or 7 key data elements, which you already do. And you just put them in this little system, and it's really a simple, elegant rule. And that's always been our message. This is actually really easy. This rule, if you get caught up in the fact of what other people have to do, it looks overwhelming. But if you just focus on what you have to do, it's super simple. I'm not a big regulation guy, but as far as regulations goes, this is a really elegant particular rule. And the And this is one of the few cases where I need a group of people to do things in a common way across a big ecosystem. There's no one else can do it except a regulator. It has to almost be compelled, and it has to be very prescribed so people know what to do. A big part of our message has been taking something that the industry talks about it in a real complicated, complex, and they get all hung up on talking about the challenges and stuff like that. And we just focus on, look, this is all you have to do. It's actually not that hard. And when people go, I already do all that. That's exactly what we found. They go, I already do it. I have piles of paper sitting in file cabinets with all those records. Getting people to focus on the simple tasks that they have to do has been for us really helpful.
You may have already covered this, but what advice would you give to founders who are entering a regulated industry for the first time?
Don't get too hung up on the regulation. That's really the moral of our whole story. Compliance requirement is a duty, and we help people to be compliant with it, but we really want to focus on bringing them some other value other than just being compliant with the rule. I guess maybe you could look at some regulations and say those aren't good regulations. I'll flash back to the opioid treatment program thing. Opioid treatment programs, they're regulated by SAMHSA, not by the FDA, which I believe is a substance abuse something agency. And the rule there was for patients who get take homes, there was a rule about how long it took before you could give it to them, unless the doctor made an exception. Our technology was protecting the medicine in a way and giving him information while the medicine was with the patient, but not at the OTP, that made the doctor say, hey, I can give this to you sooner, which is really important because that period of time was like 6 months for patients to wait in line for this medicine at every single day. They'd have to come and show up every day. This allowed them to give take homes faster and more of them. But the only rule was to put it in a lockbox. So we built our solution to say it's just a lockbox. It just happens to be connected to the internet and tell you about what's happening to the medicine while it's out there. And it's about being creative. And you have to be compliant with the letter of the law, but don't get too tied up in trying to please the regulator.
Being in insurance, we have to deal with compliance and various issues all the time. We're not going to bend rules, but there are times where we have to be practicable about how we take care of our clients. And as long as you're doing the right thing by the client, we tend to look at it, what was the spirit behind that, and how do we best take care of people and maintain that spirit of things?
This reminds me of when I was in the Army. You had security. You
Mhm.
can create a security protocol that's so onerous that nobody follows it. So look at passwords. If I say you have to have a password that's 50 digits long, what are you going to do? You're going to write a 50-digit password on a note and put it on your computer, which of course defeats the whole purpose of the password in the first place, right? The spirit of compliance. If I make it so hard to be compliant, I'll just bypass it, right? That's just user behavior.
If you work in the Medicare market, if I take a call, I'm supposed to record the entire call. And I can't even proceed with the call without informing you that I'm supposed to record it, even if you're just calling in to confirm the time of your appointment. And I completely understand why, because there are like large call centers with outbound calls and all that. And at the same time, if I am telling somebody who's 88 years old that I have to record a call just for them to confirm an appointment time, they're going to hang up the phone. They're going to find another agent.
No, I mean, it's very valid though.
If we shift gears a little bit, because you've had experience across so many industries, what would you say success looks like for you today, and how has that definition changed through your career?
As you start in your career, it's just about being competent at things. And right now, from success is creating a company that has an impact, right, on the ecosystem community that we're trying to address, right, and leadership in the marketplace. It can be very narrowly defined, just to be the best at something. That's really our goal, is to be just the best at the part of the marketplace where we're addressing.
What would a younger version of yourself, if he were starting out today, what's one piece of advice you'd offer him or her? I know you have a daughter who's getting ready to launch.
I have several kids, and I tell them all I would go ahead and have a business as soon as I could. I'm really trying to encourage them all to have a little bit of a side gig or to figure out a way to entrepreneurialize something. I was in the Army for 4 years, and then I worked for big global network equipment manufacturers. And those are big, comfortable organizations where you had roles and you learn. I learned a lot of skills and got to do some things at massive scale. You could talk about this turned out to be $1 billion project, which of course no individual ever does that by themselves, but you're part of it and you get to talk about big numbers and stuff like that. But I would say get very operational and figure out how to transact, business, from end to end. Have a group of peers and friends. The most successful guys are guys who have their own business. There's a few guys that stayed in a big corporate thing and they rose to the top and they killed it. But for the most part, all the other guys are just hanging on, just trying to get to retirement or whatever. I think you can do that in a mid-sized business. I never worked in a smaller. I only worked in giant companies or my own. I've never worked in like a mid-sized company where you could be really influential as a single individual. Even though I had big jobs in big companies, you never were that impactful individually.
I guess it depends on how you define impact, but I do think there's a certain scrappiness that comes from running and operating a business either for a long time or doing like you've done, where you've been across several types of business. And maybe that's why we define success in a way and look at business owners as successful, is because you have to learn how to figure things out in a way that sometimes you're not going to get from middle management in a bank. And I use that as an example because I've had a couple of guests already who have transitioned from corporate banking. Pop quiz. If you had to name a book or a podcast or a YouTube channel that you have found to be particularly helpful as you've developed yourself as a business leader, would you share that with us?
I got to say, one of the most formative things that I did really early in my career was the Dale Carnegie stuff. I actually worked for one of their sponsors for a while when I got out of the Army. So I had a lot of, personal experience with that, but I saw it really have a positive impact. And I've recommended it to a couple of my friends, and you could just see a bump in their trajectory. So there are the books, and then there's the courses. I found those to be really super useful.
Where could our listeners learn more about Incesso for Food and the work you guys are doing?
Probably the best place is to follow me on LinkedIn, Jim White, RDU. Or, of course, you can go to incessoforfood.com, ENSESO, the number 4food.com. That's our website, and you get connected to our various places. But most of the content we end up doing on LinkedIn.
Sure. Are there any other parting words that you might want to give to a young entrepreneur or founder?
I was thinking about this other day. So the funny thing about business is that you feel like you lose until you win. Don't get discouraged, because until you actually have a success, it feels a lot like you're not making any progress and you're losing. And so that may be a sign that you're actually having some success. Just the fact that you're thinking that way and you're grinding through it, there's a lot of value in that.